right. Can you all hear me? I have to warm it up a little bit. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to be here, and to the fantastic team at DDRYCon for having me and putting this on. It's so funny going after Fernando because, and I swear we didn't plan this, he was actually one of the judges for the Rival 50. So I guess it's a small world in marketing. What I want to say before I get into it is my hope and my goal in doing talks like this is to try to add as much value as possible. What's going to be relevant to you from what I know, what's going to be differentiated to what you might hear from somebody else, but probably most importantly, what's going to be actionable for you to take something away and do something differently with your business or maybe your career. So, on questions, my whole thinking is like, I've done some thinking with DDRYCon on what would be most relevant, differentiated, and actionable for you all. But as I get into it and you learn a little bit more about me and Rival and the work and the research that we do, you all are going to know what's going to be most helpful. So please guide me to that by asking questions. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the questions, and if they're relevant to what I'm talking about at that moment, I will weave them in. And if not, we might have some time at the end to do the other ones, and then I'll be around for a little bit after the talk. I'm actually going to start with a quick story from the speaker dinner last night. So I was having a fascinating conversation with a couple of the other speakers, one of whom runs, I guess it's like a research market intelligence firm that looks at disruption coming out of China to how to advise businesses on kind of what's coming, what's going to be ahead of the curve for their markets in Europe and the West. And the conversation moved on to banking and fintech and all the disruption that happened there. And there was a bit of a chat about why is it so hard for these big banks, these big businesses to innovate, basically. And I jumped in, of course, you heard in my intro, before starting Rival, I was CMO of 11FS, and we were a venture builder in the fintech and the banking space. So what we did is we came into incumbent banks and built their challenger banks. So if Deutsche Bank wanted to build their version of N26, we would come in and do that. And we used to say that growth in a category is a race between challengers trying to get scale and incumbents trying to get innovation. And that was a big part of the inspiration for Rival. You know, my background is 20 years in marketing, split between a decade in agencies and a decade in startups and scale-ups. And so it's always been kind of at the center of how do you bring challenger innovation to incumbents that are already at scale. And so what we do at Rival, so we're a marketing research and consulting firm that's focused on this. Challenger brands are the Davids taking on the Goliaths, these businesses that do not have the budget and the resource to compete and yet still are able to grow. What are they doing differently? They're, of course, doing stuff differently on the product side. And even as a career marketer, the first thing I say is the best marketing is a great product. But they're also doing things differently on the marketing side. They are bringing an innovative approach to marketing because they have to, and Fernando was talking about this, they have to do more with less. They are constrained by budget and resource. And so innovation is the only way to grow. And so that is what we're trying to understand. You know, I love Fernando's presentation. And actually, we do some work with Burger King and his kind of successor over there. But it was interesting him talking about kind of the budget that he had and his team had for Burger King. And I remember we do this series of CMO roundtables, so kind of small groups, and we mix big brand CMOs and challenger brand CMOs and founders. And I remember one of the ones that we did, and we actually had, it was a guy that Fernando worked with at Unilever for a long time. And he was talking about when he was at Unilever, he ran all the personal care business, and he was talking about this big launch that they were doing. They had a $20 million budget. And the guy sitting next to him was the founder of a Series A personal care, men's hair care business in the UK. And he's like, yeah, my entire marketing budget for the year is $15,000. And that's essentially what we're trying to understand. How is it that a business with a $15,000 marketing budget can grow against these businesses that have a $50 million marketing budget? What are they actually doing differently? So the Rival 50 is kind of the culmination of all the research that we've done to date. So we are about a 50-person company right now, and we have a team of 5 people, as well as, of course, a lot of my time and the other partners in the business, dedicated specifically to research, content, events, and this mission of understanding what a challenger brands do differently. So over the last 4 years, it's my favorite stat and the one that I'm most proud of, we've spent more than 10,000 hours researching and talking to challenger brand CMOs and founders. And we've talked to a lot of them, so we have a pretty good sense of what's going on. And the Rival 50 came about, and it's going to be an annual, but in October, that was the first one. 2025 is the first one. Looking at the brands, the challenger brands that are rewriting the marketing playbook for the world of today. The Davids that are taking on the Goliaths. What does marketing innovation actually look like? There's a few QR codes throughout the presentation, so if you want to check out the report. We also just dropped a couple weeks ago the brands to watch for 2026. So a shorter report, but some of the brands that we see doing interesting things right now that we think could be on the report for 2026. All right, so our approach with this, obviously, we're not the first person to do a brand index. We're not the first person to do even a challenger brand report. But when we looked at the category, and this is something I'm going to talk about a little bit later, what is it that everybody's doing and how could we do something that is different? And our biggest observation is that most of the reports that are out there are relatively subjective. Here's a list of the top 10 challenger brands. Here's 5 brands that are doing interesting things because we think they're cool. And they might be cool, but for us and for me, marketing is a means to an end. At the end of the day, the thing that matters and why marketing exists is to grow a business. It's one of the reasons, I know Fernando was talking about Cannes. I, of course, go every year. I kind of go begrudgingly, and I always say I'm not a huge fan because I feel like there is so much conversation around marketing for the sake of marketing and advertising for the sake of advertising. Whenever somebody asks me, what do I think about that campaign? Whatever it is, maybe it's a Super Bowl ad, maybe it's, something that a new brand is doing. I'm like, I can give you my subjective opinion, but it doesn't matter until I understand what the business results were. So Fernando, given that case study, the reason that's so powerful is because, sure, it's a cool idea, but marketing is a means to an end of actually delivering business results. So that's really what we wanted to focus on and make sure, and this was the partnership with Imperial, that it stood up to scrutiny in terms of data and quantifying the impact of this challenger playbook. So our approach, we started with, we have a community of about 500 CMOs. And by the way, on our website, if you're interested, you can join that. It's based on WhatsApp. It's basically a constant 24/7 conversation with CMOs from around the world talking about challenger marketing. So we started with them, and we said, hey, who are the brands that you think are challenging convention within their category? However, we then developed a criteria for commercial momentum. So that was either revenue, if the data was publicly available, or actually we built a tool internally that looks at share of search as a leading indicator to market share change. So basically, if you have a set of 6 competitors and you are gaining more, now it's both human and agentic share of search relative to those competitors, there's about an 86% correlation between share of search increase and market share increase over time. So again, not marketing for the sake of marketing, marketing for the sake of growth. We then developed a rubric around scoring to quantify how well these brands are doing against the 3 core principles of challenger marketing, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And then Fernando and 2 other judges helped us develop the criteria, but then also broke the ties. There were 3 ties in terms of brands that had the same score, and they weighed in on which ones they thought should make the list. All right, so the core pillars of the challenger playbook and challenger brands. The first is differentiation. How do you stand out from a visual perspective, from a messaging perspective, from a beliefs perspective? This definitely ties to, actually all this stuff ties to a lot of what Fernando was talking about. Talkability. It's not just about how do you reach people, it's about how do you actually get them talking about your brands. And I'm going to talk a lot about community with a couple of the examples that I have. And then relevance. The brands that are seen as most culturally relevant within a category grow 6 times the category average. So how do you develop a connection with the audience that you're trying to reach so that they feel like you are a brand for them? This is the list. Again, you can find it on the site. Please do download the report. Obviously want to call out, there's a couple homegrown German brands here. Hyrox, one of my favorite right now. I host a CMO podcast, so we've done about, I think, 150 interviews at this point, including Moritz, who's the co-founder and CMO of Hyrox. I would definitely recommend you all checking that one out. I would say, so again, this was kind of, globally, but because it started with our community that's mostly US, UK, and Europe, there is a bit of a skew towards those regions. So I'm not saying that we uncovered every challenger brand that's crushing it in China right now. But it was interesting for me, Aldi, another German brand, it was interesting for me how many of these brands I hadn't heard of. My world for the last 4 years has been trying to look at and understand everything in the world of challenger marketing, and yet the number one brand, Buldak, which is a South Korean instant noodle company, from a data-driven perspective, the data on the commercial impact of their marketing activity and their ranking around differentiation, talkability, and relevance, they were number one. If you haven't checked them out, I would definitely check them out. But it's amazing how quickly things are changing, how quickly these categories are being disrupted. And our kind of core principle with Rival, again, the intersection of challengers trying to get scale and incumbents trying to get innovation, is that the more and the faster things change, the less relevant and the less effective the old way of doing things is going to be. So as things speed up, as disruption increases, you have to look to a new way of approaching marketing. All right, so what I'm going to do, these are the top 10. I have pulled out 3 from the top 10 that I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive on. And then I'm going to talk about the key trends wrapped around the report. And then I'm going to try to give you some very specific things to take away that, to be honest, I think this stuff is evergreen in terms of it's going to apply in Germany just like it would in the UK, just like it would in the US. But I know part of this and part of what hopefully I can bring to the table, even though I've done some work in this market, my background and most of my experience is US and UK and helping European businesses bridge that gap. So I'm going to try to tie some of these takeaways and these insights to, if you're sitting here and are part of a German business that's looking to go west, how you can apply these principles. Are Crocs cool in Germany? I'm genuinely curious. Can I get a show of hands? Would you consider, yes, I heard one yes. All right, maybe, all right. Crocs is, so within Rival Amp, our CMO community, I get a lot of shit because my favorite challenger brand is Crocs. And the reason it's my favorite challenger brand is that, for those of you that remember, Crocs was maybe arguably cool 20, 25 years ago. If you remember Mario Batali, Crocs was a cool brand. They were then a very, very uncool brand. It is hard enough to build a successful challenger brand once. To do it twice, I think, is amazing. And if you look at, in the US or the UK, and I guess maybe in Germany, anybody under the age of 25, chances are they have at least one pair of Crocs and Jibbitz. So it's amazing what they've done. And you can see some of the takeaways here. I think the thing that I want to call out, and that I hope can be actionable to people in this room, we did some research earlier last year on microcultures. So going back to that stat of the brands that are seen as most culturally relevant grow 6 times the category average, that has always been true. What has changed and what challenger brands are taking advantage of now is that culture used to be macro. It used to be monoculture. It used to be top-down. It used to be one thing, one trend for everybody. Now, and I always use the example of my 14-year-old daughter, it's amazing working in marketing how much of an advantage it is to have teenage kids. She, for example, when I was her age, I listened to one genre of music, and there was like a group of kids at school, and we listened to that one genre of music. She, with Spotify, and obviously tech drives a lot of this disruption, she'll listen to country music, she'll listen to rap music, she'll listen to rock, she'll listen to anything. Culture has been fragmented. And what challenger brands are doing differently, again, because they don't have the budget or the resource to compete, they have to innovate, is that they're like, oh, we can't go sponsor Bayern Munich. We can't go get the A-list influencer. But you know what? There's this 7th division football team in the Bundesliga or whatever that is really coming up that seems to have, if you know Wrexham in the UK, right? These pockets of passion and community that drive relevance with, yes, a smaller audience, but more intense relevance, and competitors are not playing there. So what Crocs has done really well is they have developed maybe some technology, but a lot of this stuff just comes down to talent. Like I think it was yesterday on the panel that I was moderating on how to take German businesses to the UK and the US, there was a question around how do you really understand kind of the cultural nuances in a country? And I was moderating, so people weren't there to hear my answers, but I'm going to give it to you now. You got to hire a 20-something-year-old, or if you don't have a teenage kid, get a couple of them around you. Like the idea of taste and what is culturally relevant is not something that's going to come out of AI. It's not something that's going to come out of technology. It's something that I wish I had a better answer for you of like, you can go buy this tool and figure it out. But a lot of this is like, you just need to live and breathe the world that your audience is actually in. And so Crocs has done a really great job of identifying not who's the biggest musician right now. They're not sponsoring or doing collabs with Taylor Swift. They are doing collabs with 6 musicians that I've never heard of, but my 14-year-old daughter has heard of. And the same thing with art, and the same thing with sports. So they are taking these microcultures and really applying them at scale to drive cultural relevance in a way that probably as a 40-something-year-old guy in the UK, I have no idea about, and yet it's driven the growth of the business over the last couple of years. So again, maybe it's obvious, but just to kind of land on that point, if you're a German business looking at the UK and the US, the specific thing that I would tell you to do is, if you do not feel like you have an understanding of what the 14-year-olds, the 25-year-olds in the UK and the US, and of course this depends on your industry, if you're a B2B enterprise technology company, the principle still exists of what are the microcultures around your audience, but it's not going to be a 14-year-old girl that's going to tell you that. How do you get an understanding of the microcultures that are driving relevance within your audience, and then figure out a way to contribute to those conversations? Okay, cereal company. You would think General Mills, these big incumbent businesses, how do you actually break through as a cereal company? You can see some of the takeaways here. The one that I would call out for you, because they have done stuff with relevance, and they've done stuff with talkability as well. But everything that they have done comes from a place of, and I don't know, we are getting them on the podcast actually, but I haven't interviewed them yet. I don't know if this is intentional. I would imagine in the beginning it wasn't. A lot of these founder-led businesses, it's kind of like that Henry Ford quote of, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. They're not going on customer data. They're going on taste and intuition. And I'm always conscious of survivorship bias, because for every one of the Henry Fords, there were probably 99 that had an idea and it was just wrong. But it's probably necessary but not sufficient as a challenger brand to have a strong idea about what needs to change within the category. So very specifically, again, our whole business is understanding what challenger brands do differently and then bringing that to blue chip businesses. We start every engagement with an exercise that we call mapping the category convention. So we say, all right, here's the list of competitors that you have. We're going to go look at everything that they do. We literally put it up on a wall or a mural board if it's happening virtually. And it is amazing how similar so much of the marketing, so much of the packaging, so much of the messaging, so much of the visual identity is in so many of these categories. And by the way, if you are in B2B, I have a special spot in my heart for B2B marketing because it doesn't get a lot of love. And I was a B2B CMO for 3 years. That is just more true, and therefore there's more opportunity. Surreal, and a lot of these challenger brands, again, whether it was intentional, whether there was a process, or whether it was just the gut intuition, the box looks completely different. The colors, the typography, the flavors. When you walk down the supermarket aisle, that is going to stand out compared to the category convention of how everything else looks. So a specific thing I think anybody can do, and again, particularly if you're looking at a new market, what is the category convention in that market? And how do you make sure that if you do something, it's going to be different enough to stand out? One of the specific things that I use with my team that might be helpful is whatever we are doing with Rival, you can take this report as an example. I always say, if we take our logo off of it, could it be one of our competitors? We obviously aspire, we're a small business, but we aspire to compete with the likes of McKinsey or WPP or whatever. Does this look, if you took the Rival logo off of it, does this look like something McKinsey would do? Or does this look like something WPP would do? So if you took your logo off of it, Could it be one of your competitors? That's when you know that you've pushed hard and far enough on differentiation. Nothing Technology, a business out of the UK. Who would have thought that between Apple and Google, there was space for a challenger phone? What they've done, and they're still small, but they are growing, what they've done that I will call out from this one is they've really leaned in to this idea that we see with challenger brands around community. One of the things that I like to say to hopefully help ground this for people, because I think community is a topic that gets talked about a lot, but it's like, what do we actually mean by community? At a high level, the difference between a community and an audience is which way the chairs are facing. How is the conversation happening, and where is the value exchange happening? Right now, you're an audience. I'm speaking to you and hopefully giving you some value. If, or let's just say, forget you all joining, but the CMOs that are in our rival AMP community, I'm chiming in and sharing interesting things that I'm seeing, but most of the value that they are getting is from each other. Other CMOs asking questions, sharing resources. How can you actually create, and this is something that Nothing has done really well, they've created this community for people to interact with each other and find value from each other. A very hard thing to do, because at the end of the day, the businesses that are more long-term oriented will win. Because in the short term, as a business, you're focused on extracting value from the customer. In the long term, if you can push it out far enough, you're focused on how do I add value? I don't need to extract value right now. I'm going to try to add value for as long as I possibly can. Community is a very, very long-term play. In order to do it well, and this is why most people don't, you have to approach it with a 1-2 year view. Our view for Rival AMP, our CMO community, is that in 5 years, maybe it's driving business for us. But for now, we are only focused on adding value with it. Okay, key insights. And if any questions come up, I think I'm in the right spot. Just let me know. So trend number 1, belonging as a brand ecosystem. Again, a lot of these examples are consumer, and a lot of them are, let's say, fast-moving goods, shoes. That coffin is actually Liquid Death, which is a bottled water, actually a canned water company out of the US. But the principles, I think, are still relevant and apply to any category. So belonging as a branding ecosystem. I think the place that I would start with this is that overall, technology lowers the barrier to production and distribution, both of marketing, but also of products, again, depending on the category, but that is the trend, right? Like progress is only gonna go in that direction. It's only gonna get easier for people to produce more content or introduce a new competitor into the sector. And so as people have more choice, both for what they choose to buy and how they choose to spend their time and their attention, it is no longer enough to have or communicate rational benefits, right? Your shoe, your water company, your tech solution can do X, Y, and Z. That's no longer enough. What we are seeing in this research is that people also want to feel like they're part of something. There's a sidebar to this conversation that is the whole purpose-driven brands trend that kind of went like this for a while. And obviously Fernando and a bunch of people were at Unilever, where famously the CEO at one point said that every brand needs to have a purpose. And so you had like a mayonnaise brand that was saying it was saving the world. It went a little bit overboard, let's say. It's come back a little bit. But that's relevant to this conversation. What can you offer to people that they feel like they're getting value from by participating in your brand, not just by buying your product? So how do you think about, how do I make people feel like they belong and I'm not just selling them something? Ideological polarity is differentiation. So talked about differentiation a good amount. The thing that I would add here is that a lot of what we see from these brands is not just if we took our logo off of it, could it be one of our competitors? The differentiation at the micro level of a campaign or a piece of content, a activation, but also the aggressive differentiation at the macro level of what do we stand for? And a lot of these businesses, again, in order to stand out, in order to compete, they are pushing that very far. So they are really putting a stake in the ground and a flag in the ground of we are for this, and oftentimes they're also saying we are against that. And for traditional marketers and the incumbent playbook, and a lot of how big businesses operate, They, and Fernando talked about fear, they come from a place of like, I don't want to piss people off. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to expose ourselves to, any potential liability or things like that. And I totally get it. I've worked in and with the Fortune 500 businesses of this world for a long time. I totally understand the reality of it. But just understand that one of the fundamental advantages that these businesses have over you is that they are more willing to take risks. And they're more able to move faster once they decide to do something. So if you are a challenger brand, maybe this grounds what you're already thinking about. How can you push it a little bit further? If you are an incumbent brand and you're like, I've got all the lawyers, I've got all the bureaucracy, I can't just be out there saying that we are against something. How do you maybe push it 5 or 10%? How do you be a little bit more differentiated in your ideology and how you come to market? Media-minded amplification. I'll reference another one of Fernando's slides that I thought was really interesting, where he showed that pie graph, and he said, I think it was 70% of advertising effectiveness is brand and creative. 100%. Creative is the variable of success. Marketing is how do you tell a story that changes perception and behavior to deliver business results. However, what has changed and what challenger brands have recognized and are taken advantage of is that in order to tell somebody a story, in order to show them your brand and your creative, you first need their attention. And attention is the scarcest and most valuable commodity for modern marketers. So much of this industry, so many of these presentations, all this stuff, it focuses on the story down. What these brands are doing differently and where they are starting is they are saying, we don't have the budget to compete. We can't buy attention. How do we earn attention? And so they are actually thinking and acting more like a media company rather than a traditional marketing function. What's the difference? A media company's entire business model is based on attention. How do I get your attention? How do I keep your attention? And then how do I monetize your attention? So if you think like an editor-in-chief or the CEO of a media business instead of a CMO, you're adjusting and focusing more on how do I earn and keep people's attention in order to then tell them a story, as opposed to what's the story, if we put it out there, people will pay attention. Okay, key takeaways. So what I'm hoping people can do differently walking out of this room for their businesses, either in this market or certainly if you're looking at the UK or the US where it is a bigger market, or at least the US is. It's very competitive. There's a lot of cultural nuance. It's really hard to stand out. First, you need to make sure that you are focusing your communication on a point of difference, not a value proposition. It's not enough to say what your product is. You have to say explicitly and communicate explicitly, both in words, but also in visual identity and any advertising or communications you do, why it's different. Next, think about community and which way the chairs are facing, how you can add value through what you do. But also think about community as an opportunity to co-create with your audience. One of the things that they did really well, and going back to the story I told at the beginning of being there in the early days of Revolut and Monzo and N26 and all that, Monzo did this really well as well. They created a community and actually leveraged that to get input and ideas on how to develop the product and how to develop the brand. So what can you do with your business, particularly if you're looking at a new market, to say, hey, we don't know everything. We're going to do our research. We're going to build our team. But hey, audience that we're trying to reach, what ideas do you have? How can you make that work? Activate microcultures, not audiences. The biggest shift, when we bring the microcultures research and the microcultures methodology into a Burger King, the biggest shift is that a lot of the incumbent playbook when it comes to how do I think about an audience is demographic segmentation. I want to reach 40-year-old white guys who live in London and do X, Y, and Z. The shift that we're bringing, and that I'd recommend you all to think about, particularly with new markets, is like, yes, you need to understand that, who's the audience that you want to reach, but then you also need to understand what are the microcultures around them that are most influencing their perception and behavior, and how do we contribute to those microcultures and micro-communities through the communication and the advertising that we do. And that's what you activate on. And then lastly, think and act like a media company, not a marketing function. The first job of marketing is to get people's attention. And this is what these challenger brands do really well. And then, to the 70% stat, the brand and the creative needs to be there in order for it to be effective. But if you don't have the attention, That is 0% effectiveness for brand and creative. All right. Again, QR codes, you can check out the 2026 brands to watch, and that is it. Do we have time? I saw a couple questions just come through. Do we have time for that?
Maybe I will join you on stage.
Sure.
And we got together through the audience questions. And yes, we have 3 questions. Maybe you just pick 2.
Sure. Do you want me to pick them or you want to pick them?
But first of all, thank you so much for your interesting insights, Eric. And I have one question. I mean, you're really inspiring because you have spoken with more than 250 of the world's top CMOs. After talking to so many challenger brands and marketers, you probably have seen it all. So, what's the one thing the great ones have and the average just doesn't? Is there one thing you've seen overall?
Okay, so I give 2 answers to this question. One is kind of expected and one is surprising to me. So the one that is expected is, at the end of the day, if you boil it all down, and again, this was the conversation we were having about these challenger banks and these incumbent banks, most things that matter are simple but hard. When it comes to growing a business, the simple but hard answer with all these interviews is that if you can deliver relevant and differentiated value to the needs of the customer, your business will grow. And if you can't, then it won't. And the number one thing that I get from all of these CMOs that I interview, whether they're at a challenger brand or whether they're at an incumbent brand, is that they are relentlessly focused on understanding the needs of the customer. So that'd be the number one thing. The other one that is not like not the biggest thing, but has come up so often and doesn't get talked about enough that I always like to offer it up when I get asked that question, is it's amazing how often the CMOs I interview have a very specific, what I call framework for innovation. They don't just assume that innovation will happen. They have something like 10% of my budget always goes towards trying crazy new ideas. Or 20% of my team's time is on new things that we haven't done yet. So this kind of structured framework for innovation is the other one that I see pretty often that I actually think is something that people can take away and do something differently with relatively quickly.
So focus on innovation is always a good idea. Great, thank you for that. And yeah, let's check the audience questions. Yeah, interesting. How do you test an idea when you have 0 budget? Is that possible? Have you seen that?
100% it's possible. So again, it's time and budget. Right? You might have 0 budget, but you have time. We all have the same amount of time. And actually, it's a really interesting opportunity right now to be doing this because one of the biggest shifts, I spent 7 years at VaynerMedia, and it went from 15 people to 1,500 people in the time that I was there. And that was really on the back of Web 2.0, of social media becoming a mainstream channel. And the biggest shift that's happened, back then, social was about the social graph, obviously. You connected to people that you knew. And in order to market to people, you had to have a big following, and then you had to put paid behind it and all that. Because these platforms, the Metas, the TikToks of the world, what they care about is attention, they obviously have now evolved their business to focus on not who do you know, but what's most interesting and relevant to you. So we've gone from a social graph to an interest graph in what matters most. So you don't need 100,000 followers on Instagram in order for your content to be surfaced. It just has to be really, really good. So if you have time and you can put out consistently more organic content, if it's good enough, it will find an audience. So actually, it's a great opportunity for businesses that don't have the dollars. But of course, you still need the time, because if you don't have the dollars or the time, then you can't do anything.
So then times the budget you have.
Yeah.
Again, what our audience really wants to know is, have you ever seen a very crazy, very extraordinary marketing campaign that really surprised you?
I was in Paris a few weeks ago, and Bullback was at the top of this list. They had a pop-up store that was it must have been, I didn't go in because the line was literally 2 hours long. It was for instant noodles. There were probably 200 people that lined up for 2 hours on a cold day in Paris to get into this noodle drop situation. So like you would go in with a garbage bag and you had 10 seconds to just pull out as many boxes of noodles as possible. So I just think about that. Like that is an instant noodle company. Talk about a commoditized kind of low value product. And there are these people that are lining up and spending their time to do something like that. So again, they needed to have some budget, obviously, because they rented out the space and everything. But that is very much, the term guerrilla marketing and all that stuff. Really what that means is we don't have the money to buy the attention. Buldak is not doing a big TV campaign or an out-of-home campaign in Paris, but they use creativity to come up with a way to get people to think that the brand is relevant and also to talk about the activation with other people.
It's all about creativity. Fernando also said, I think we have no more time left. Are you here around?
I am. Yes, I'll be around. So would love to answer the questions that we didn't get to. And thank you so much for the time.
Take the chance and grab them. Thank you so much, Eric Fulwiler.